There is a moment in every empire's life cycle that determines everything that follows. It is not a war, not a revolution, not a barbarian invasion or a sudden market crash. It is quieter than that, more insidious, and far more decisive. It is the moment when power stops coming from making things and starts coming from managing things. Every empire believes this transition makes it stronger. It feels like reaching the peak of civilization. It feels like sophistication and maturity. But history shows this is actually the moment strength stops compounding. It is the point where the engine of growth is replaced by the machinery of maintenance. Once this transition occurs, the empire's trajectory is already set, even if it takes another century to play out. Most people miss this moment entirely, because it does not feel like collapse. Markets still function, wealth still grows, institutions still look strong. Professionals still show up to work every morning, clutching their credentials and optimizing their spreadsheets. But underneath the surface, at the foundation of the civilization, something fundamental has shifted. The system no longer exists to create new value. It exists to allocate, regulate, protect, and preserve existing value. History shows, with zero exceptions, that once this shift completes, everything that follows is structural. Not optional, not reversible, structural. Before looking at history, it is important to understand why this distinction matters at all. Look at any modern society and ask a simple question. Where did the smartest people go? How many are building things, and how many are managing rules, compliance, finance, coordination, and allocation? How much growth comes from producing new goods and services, and how much comes from asset prices, leverage, and financial engineering? These are not political questions. They are structural ones. The transition from production to management does not announce itself. It hides behind competence, credentials, and stability. By the time it becomes obvious, the system is already locked into place. Production is the act of bringing something into the world that did not exist before. Food, energy, tools, technology, infrastructure, goods people willingly pay for. Production creates surplus by transforming raw materials and human intelligence into something more valuable than the sum of the inputs. That surplus is real power, because real power increases the total amount of value available to the system. Management is different. Management allocates existing resources. It regulates access, taxes flows, organizes distribution, enforces rules, and manages risk. These things are necessary. A complex society cannot function without them. But management is not generative. It does not create new value. It rearranges claims on value someone else already produced. This distinction explains the central pattern of empire. Empires rise by producing. They stabilize by organizing production. They peak by managing the surplus, and they decline by managing everything while producing too little. This is not a moral judgment. It is mechanics. The pattern begins clearly with Rome. Early Rome was a society of producers. Small farmers owned land and produced food. Citizen soldiers fought wars and returned to their farms. Trade routes expanded across the Mediterranean, and goods flowed freely. Wealth came from output, from growing more food, opening new markets, and expanding trade. As Rome expanded, managing the empire became more important than expanding production within it. Tax collection grew complex. Military logistics became permanent. Supply chains required administrators. Provinces required governors. Trade required regulation. You needed people to manage the people who managed things. Over time, administration grew faster than production. Small, efficient family farms were replaced by massive estates owned by the elite and worked by slaves. These estates were less productive per acre than the farms they replaced. Slave labor had no incentive to innovate, and a single overseer could not manage land as effectively as many independent farmers. But for the Roman bureaucracy, these estates were preferable. It was easier to tax one wealthy landowner than thousands of independent farmers. Rome sacrificed the productive capacity of its soil for the administrative convenience of its tax collectors. By the 3rd century, the management layer was so heavy that the productive base began to suffocate. When the state faced deficits, it did not look for ways to increase production. It looked for ways to increase management. Price controls were introduced. Currency was debased. Professions were made hereditary. Rome tried to command and control its way out of a production problem, and it failed. You cannot administrate your way into abundance. Rome spent 200 years optimizing its decline, managing a shrinking pie until there was nothing left to manage. Spain made the same mistake, faster. When silver from the Americas flooded into Spain, it created the illusion of limitless wealth. Why build industries when treasure arrives automatically? Why innovate when taxes fund everything? Spain optimized for management. It managed silver flows, managed debt borrowed against future shipments, managed wars across Europe, and managed trade monopolies. But it produced almost nothing. The silver influx caused massive inflation. Prices inside Spain surged while remaining stable in countries that actually produced goods. Spanish manufacturing collapsed, and imports replaced domestic production. When the silver flows slowed in the 17th century, Spain looked around and realized it had no factories, no merchant class, and no modern agriculture. It had spent a century becoming the most sophisticated manager of wealth on earth, only to discover that when the wealth stops moving, the manager has nothing. Britain industrialized the world. Textiles, steel, railroads, shipbuilding. For a century, British production defined global power. After dominance was secured, Britain shifted toward finance. This was rational. Manufacturing was messy and unstable. Finance was clean and predictable. Capital followed incentives. British investors financed global industry instead of domestic production. By the early 20th century, Germany and the United States were outproducing Britain in steel, chemicals, and manufacturing capacity. When total war arrived, Britain discovered a hard truth. You cannot fight a total war with financial claims. You fight it with steel, chemicals, and oil. Britain had the money, but it had lost the capacity. Its political empire collapsed shortly afterward because its economic engine had already been replaced by a ledger. This pattern repeats because management is self-reinforcing. As systems become more complex, they require more management to remain stable. But that management adds friction, and friction makes production slower, riskier, and more expensive. Think about the life cycle of a company. In the beginning, everyone produces. As the company grows, managers are added to coordinate production. That is healthy. But eventually, managers begin hiring other managers to manage the managers. Producers become a minority. They spend their time filling out forms, attending meetings, and complying with processes. The path to success shifts. Not through building better products, but through navigating internal bureaucracy. The company stops being a production engine and becomes a compliance engine. Now scale that up to an entire civilization. How do you know when an empire has crossed this threshold? There are 4 structural symptoms. First, growth becomes dependent on leverage. When production stalls, the only way to grow is to borrow from the future. Debt expands, asset prices inflate, claims on value grow faster than value itself. Second, decision-making slows to a crawl. Production requires fast iteration. Management requires consensus and compliance. Projects take decades. Nothing gets built. Third, failure becomes unacceptable. In productive systems, failure releases resources to better uses. In management systems, failure threatens stability. Failing institutions are preserved. Zombie companies persist. Stagnation becomes permanent. Fourth, prestige flips. In rising empires, the most respected figures are builders and inventors. In declining empires, prestige shifts to intermediaries, consultants, lawyers, fund managers, and bureaucrats. When the smartest people stop solving physical problems and start solving compliance problems, the transition is complete. Once management dominates production, history allows only three outcomes. The first is inflation. The state prints more claims on value to compensate for the lack of real production. This can last decades until confidence breaks. The second is restructuring. A shock forces the management layer to collapse. It is painful and destroys wealth, but it clears the system. The third is the long fade. The empire does not collapse. It simply becomes irrelevant. It manages its old wealth while the future is built somewhere else. This is the path most empires choose because it is the least disruptive, but it is still decline. This is not a story about villains. It is a story about incentives. Empires do not fall because they run out of money. They fall because they run out of generative energy. They become so focused on managing the present that they forget how to build the future. Once you see this pattern, you see it everywhere, in companies, institutions, cultures, and empires. And once you see it, you are no longer surprised by the outcome. If this clarified something structural, not speculative, subscribe to Empire's Dawn. This channel exists to explain how systems actually work beneath the surface. Not to scare you, not to reassure you, but to show you the pattern before it disappears into inevitability.